Okay, welcome. So today, before I start the course of today, which will be on Lenia, I wanted just to add some little things to the last course because I really did not say what I wanted to say in the end. It was a bit confused. So I just wanted to add a few things about Turing patterns very quickly. So as we mentioned last time, Turing patterns, they were initially studied by Turing to learn about morphogenesis, mainly understanding. So the main point he does in his paper is that these reaction diffusion models, they explain how you can go from a symmetric initial condition to something which breaks this symmetry, but which breaks this symmetry in a consistent way, in such a way that you get always kind of the shape that you want in the end. So that's why Turing studied and introduced these reaction diffusion models. But since then, people actually learned that in nature, there are many different examples where you have such reaction diffusion systems or systems which are almost like reaction diffusions. Sometimes you may need to add like flow, as we saw last time, instead of diffusion. You may need to add some extra kind of bits, but the spirit of the thing is still the same. And so here I have a few examples. So you see in fish here with the spots. And here on the right are simulations using some reaction diffusion system. So in particular, this system is one where you need to add a radial flow. Okay, that's how you get these kind of radial kind of patterns like that, but it's still reaction diffusions with a flow equation. This is some skin of some animal. I don't know which one now, but it looks very much like the kind of things you see when you look at Turing patterns. This is another example. So below you have the skin of several animals like giraffes, cheetahs, etc. And above you have some reaction diffusion model where you tune the parameters to get something which is very similar. And at least qualitatively, it looks very much like it could produce such patterns. And in addition to that, it's also plausible in terms of what's happening physically or chemically, because the reaction diffusion system, as we saw, they're essentially just differential equations for chemicals interacting together. So when you have a bunch of chemical equations, you can translate it into these reaction diffusion models. And so one interesting thing about that I thought about, okay, it's not very important, but is that if you get a cheetah and then you clone it, you will not get the exact same cheetah, right? Precisely because the pattern of his spots are created by reaction diffusion. So they will always be spots that have the same qualitative like feel, but the exact location on the spot depends on the precise perturbation you had at the very beginning of the reaction diffusion process, right? Because the reaction diffusion process tends to accentuate these asymmetries and create these patterns. So if indeed these patterns are created by reaction diffusion, they are not controlled exactly by the gene. So the gene might control the parameters of the reaction diffusion equation. So say one cheetah has denser spots than another, but the precise location of a spot is just random according to whatever happened when this reaction diffusion process started, okay? And I believe you can observe this in nature. I haven't checked, but I'm 100% sure that if it's like some reaction diffusion process, this will hold. So that's an interesting thought. So this is another thing. This is some lizard scales. So here you see that it looks quite discrete, okay? You have some sort of pattern, Turing-like pattern, but it's very rare to have one scale which is colored in between two colors. It does happen for some scales, but mostly it's discrete. And you can show that you can obtain this with a Turing reaction diffusion model where you decrease kind of the permeability at the edge of the cells, right? So the chemicals have a harder time diffusing through the cell. And then if you choose your parameters correctly, you can get some reaction diffusion model, which is continuous with some bumps, of course, in the permeability. And it will essentially simulate a discrete cellular automaton system, okay? Because for these lizard scales, you also have a pretty good model, which is purely a cellular automaton on the scale. And so you can look at these papers here, that they show that you can use Turing patterns to reproduce a cellular automaton. And that's something I wanted to mention because it's this connection between how you get something discrete from the continuous. And so maybe with some approach similar to that, you could design a continuous system, a reaction diffusion system, which is Turing complete in the discrete sense, right? Just make a reaction diffusion system which generates the game of life, for example. Yes?
This has to do with the Ising model, right?
Right. So one of these paper, they show that in addition to being able to reproduce these patterns with reaction diffusion and a cellular automaton, they're also able to generate them using an Ising model at some specific, like, I don't know if it's a criticality or something like that. So I don't know the details, but it is indeed related. So people have also models which model this thing with the Ising model, but I don't know the details. Yeah.
I think they are essentially saying that the kind of the lizard scales change with some Monte Carlo dynamics. Like
Right.
The scale is picked at random and then it maybe changes color depending on
the energy landscape.
Yeah.
Yeah, so exactly. So in this paper, they kind of make a connection with the Ising model for the people that know what it is. It's a physics system where it's initially it was used to model magnetic materials. So it's a bunch of spins, which can be in several directions, and the spins tend to want to align. But according to a temperature, they also tend to misalign. And so if you want to read more about this paper, they show how you can also get some kind of cellular automaton dynamics from the dynamics of the Ising model. And I don't know the broader implications of that, but if it's something that interests you, you can read here. Okay, some other examples. In fish, also many fish, not only guppies, but also, forget how they're called, I think zebrafish, were studied because I think they were one of the first examples where people could actually show, like, experimentally that there was some sort of reaction diffusion thing happening in the background. So here you see this, again, a reaction diffusion model which is slightly changed, slightly non-local because they have a kernel, but you again get this reproduction. And the last thing that I wanted to show you was one specific parameter for the Gray-Scott model that we saw last week that I didn't know existed, which is called the U-skate world. And this one is particularly interesting because it has very robust solitons. Okay, so it's still the Gray-Scott model. Here, somebody is clicking on the screen to add and remove matter. That's why things appear from nowhere. But as you can see, you have these little balls that are pretty self-contained, but that can assemble in quite complex assemblies. Okay, you can have some spaceships, and then the interaction, what's really cool, is that the interaction are very robust. Okay, so these kind of balls and circles are very distinct. They don't merge easily. And so this is one example of, let's say, where you could use reaction diffusion models to actually have some sort of alive system. And okay, here you have some sort of instability. At some point, something just breaks off and colonizes everything, and it stops being interesting. But I didn't know there were these kind of, even in reaction diffusion, you can have these models which are very lifelike, let's say. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say for the reaction diffusions. Are there any other questions about this? Otherwise, we move on to today's subject, which is Lenia and all the Lenia derivatives, which we'll see. So the Slido is here. We only have 2 questions today because there is a lot of material, so I try to be a bit faster than last week. Few announcements. I forgot that. So first of all, if you're interested in implementing cellular automata using Python, I made a tutorial which is about 1 hour, much longer than I thought, but it was necessary, about how to use the code base that I'm using to show you all the simulation, or almost all the simulations. And so in the tutorial, essentially, I go through all the steps of how do you install this thing, and I really go step by step how to implement the game of life with interactivity and also a falling sun game with interactivity. So if you're interested in trying your hand, definitely look at this tutorial. And I was also supposed to put a link for a doodle to settle a day for the presentations, but I forgot to do that, so I will send it to you by email, or you can also find it in the Notion notebook. Okay, I have a bunch of references today. A lot of these things, I really suggest you you go take a look, because a lot of those are interactive papers. So you have the paper, but you have simulations along with it that you can play with and interact with, and it's really cool. A lot of videos, so it's very enjoyable to read these papers. Okay, other than that, let's get started. So if there are any problems with the stream, let me know, but I think everything is fine because my father hasn't called me. So, okay, so what is Lenia? So Lenia is an artificial life system. And the way to think about it, or the way it was conceived at least, is as a continuous version of the game of life. Okay. So it was invented by Bert Chan. And I think, I mean, I don't know when it was invented exactly, but the first paper, at least the first paper that I saw, was in 2018. There might have been some YouTube videos before, I'm not sure. And yeah, so Bert Chan is now a researcher at Google working on artificial life. But at the time, I think he had an IT store and just did it on his own time. And it's kind of crazy that thanks to this invention that he put out, well, he got a job at Google doing artificial life, which is kind of the dream in this field, I would say. So the typical dynamics of Lenia, I already showed them the very first day, but they look like this. So the model looks very continuous, right? So you don't have any pixelization or whatever. And if you tune your parameters correctly, you get a lot of this behavior where you have these individual creatures that interact in seemingly non-trivial way. And the diversity of the creatures that you get is also pretty big. Okay, you have some nice behaviors like self-replications here. So you have a creature that replicates. You can do stuff with more colors, etc. Still self-replication. You have non-trivial interactions between the things. So you have these creatures here that bump each other without destroying, etc. So it looks very cool. So yeah, so we have all the nice properties in this system of self-organization. Okay, you can start from random initial conditions. You will get some things that emerge. You have solitons, you have interaction between solitons, self-reproduction, and so on. So it's a very promising system from this video alone. And yeah, so this already said, Lenia is now I would say it's the most popular continuous artificial life systems, and it inspired many like spin-off systems which inspired from Lenia. And I think we can assign it the title of the continuous game of life, because before the game of life was also clearly the most well-known cellular automaton. Well, Lenia is probably this title so far, at least for the continuous systems. Yeah, to link with the previous course, if you compare it with reaction diffusion, I would say that it has a much higher diversity of behaviors. And at the same time, it's much simpler to simulate because you don't have all the stability issues that I mentioned last time. So you don't have to fine-tune your reaction function such that it does not explode or does not implode, etc. And as for the impressive diversity of behavior, I'm not sure this is really a property that reaction diffusion is missing. It may be that just because reaction diffusion is so finicky to work with and as such as huge space in which to research, like just the space of functions, it's harder to find these cool things, but they might exist also. But at least Lenia is easier to use in that sense. So the goal for today is to first derive, kind of motivate how were the rules for Lenia invented. And then we'll present also several variations, which are also pretty popular on these rules. All right. So the origins, as we said, comes from the game of life. And Lenia can be seen, as I said, as the continuous version of the game of life. So if you remember 2 courses ago, I think, we saw something called larger than life, which was an attempt to render the game of life more continuous. And the way they did it is to take bigger and bigger neighborhoods, such that, okay, this is the game of life kernel or neighborhood. Then this is the larger than life neighborhood, which is kind of a bigger version of this. Kind of, if you zoom in and look at more details, you would see maybe this. Well, Lenia is very simple. It's just in the limit where you take this to be infinitely precise, you get some sort of continuous blob for your neighborhood. And that's what Lenia works on. So to take this continuous limit, yes?
In the second case, are there weights for the neighborhood?
Right. So in larger than life, it was not the case. So every cell in the neighborhood gave the same weight. But in Lenia, it won't be the case. So here you see that I kind of have a grayish color here. So the color here of my neighborhood means that the importance of a value at this location is less. Yes, exactly. But of course, in the multi-neighborhood cellular automata that I showed you last time, you had neighborhoods with different weights and all sorts of things. So, okay, how do we make the game of life? How do we massage it so that we can take this continuous version? Well, it's fairly simple, and essentially we already did the work in previous courses. So just to remind some notation, so by Cij, I will denote the state of the cell, of a single cell, which is at position I and j in our 2D grid world. And for the game of life, it can obviously be either 0 or 1, live or dead. Then you have the kernel here. It's a matrix, let's say, so indexed by 2 indices. And for the game of life, it's a 3 by 3 matrix. Okay, so K and L are 3 values each. And so the first thing you want to do is to compute the sum of the live neighbors. Okay, and this is the following formula. We just sum over the indices that appear in the kernel. Right, the kernel is 3 by 3. And then we multiply the value of the kernel by the value of the neighbor, right? The neighbor is located as I plus K, I plus L. Okay, so here in the game of life, it's important to multiply by the kernel. Otherwise, we would also count as a neighbor the middle state. And in general, the kernel that you use can help you weight differently the different neighbors. Okay, here it turns out that all the neighbors have the same weight, but it could be more general. So we have this formula, and so if we want to take the continuous space limit and state limit of this, because remember, if you take continuous space, you need to take continuous state. So we want to go from Cij to C of xy, where C is just a function in the reals. And this is very simple from this formula. You just replace the sum by integrals and the matrices by function. So you get that the sum of neighbor at location x, y will be an integral on x prime and y prime in the neighborhood. So it turns out that here the neighborhood is contained into -1, 1. And then you take the kernel value and multiply it by the neighbor value. Okay, the neighbor is located at x plus x prime, but it's symmetric in x prime, so x minus x prime is the same thing. And here you can see that this is simply the definition of a convolution. Okay, so all we have done in the end is that the sum of neighbor in the continuous limit is the cell state, which is also a continuous function, convolved by the kernel, which is also now a continuous function like so, right? So here, just a technicality, I could just remove these bounds for x and y prime simply because the kernel will be equal to 0 if you go far enough. And so if you integrate over everything or over just a compact neighborhood, it's the same thing. Okay, so if you want to take the limit properly, I let you think about how to do it. It's very simple. You just have to say that your kernel is n by n pixels, and then now the sum must be weighted by 1 over n because the pixels are smaller. And when you take the limit, you just get this integral. Right, so in the continuous limit, the computation of the sum of the neighbors just becomes a convolution with a kernel. So if you remember, even in the discrete case, this sum here, we could also rewrite it as a discrete convolution. So the continuous limit for this step at least goes through painlessly. You don't have to do anything, essentially. So this is for the sum of neighbors, but this operation is linear. And in general, when you keep things linear, it's hard to get interesting stuff. So we want to add some non-linearity. So in the game of life, what is this nonlinearity? The nonlinearity is simply these if-else conditions for the next state, where you say, okay, if you have two live neighbors, then you will survive, otherwise you will birth, etc. So this is a if-else condition which is nonlinear in the state. And so you can write this concisely as such. So the state at time t plus 1 is just a function, and this function is a function only of the neighbor sum and the middle state, right? Because the game of life is outer holistic, so the transition rule depends on the sum of neighbors, but as well as on the middle pixel. So for the game of life, you can convince yourself that this function here, so g30 equal 1, etc., is the one that gives you the game of life dynamics. Okay, so just for one example, what does this mean? This means that if the sum of neighbors is 3 and the state is 0, then it will become 1, right? So it will be birth. So far, so good. No comments. So again, here the continuous limit is very simple. The state at time t plus 1 is just a function, which will be now a continuous function instead of a function on the integers. And it will be a function of the sum and of the middle state. And here we do a small simplification. We essentially say, okay, in the continuous limit, we won't consider outer holistic CA. We'll just consider a holistic CA that depends only on the sum. And one way you could motivate this is, as you can see, the red pixel here, the middle pixel, as you increase the neighborhood discretization, it gets smaller and smaller. So you could argue in some way that it's kind of negligible what the middle state is, and so we just discard it. Although we could make it so it's actually important. So at the end of the day, we are left with the following equation. The state at time t plus 1 is a nonlinear function. This nonlinear function is in R. It's a nonlinear function that goes from R to R, right? Okay, and what it takes in value is the value of the convolution with the kernel. And now we're done. Okay, so that's essentially the Lenia equation. We want to do a few more cosmetic changes. Well, not entirely cosmetic, actually. I have a message. 1 second. All good. So the first thing we want more gradual changes in time, because here we are stepping by one whole time step each time, which is a bit brutal. So we split this in smaller time steps, and we give them a size, delta t. And the other thing that will change is that in the game of life, you see the value of this function g denoted exactly the next state that you should transition to. So now, since we have a smaller time step, we won't transition brutally to the target state. We want to kind of move towards the target state. So we'll change g, and g will denote the amount that we need to change the state, right? And so we get this equation here, which tells us at time t plus delta t, the new state will be the same as the previous state, plus a small change proportional to delta t. And the direction of this change will be dictated by the value of g. If g is negative, it means that you should lower your state a little bit. If g is positive, it means that you should increase your state a little bit. So the last thing we do is, because we want stability, because this is pretty unstable, right? If g is positive, and it turns out that more positive values give bigger values of g, you get an exponential explosion. So to stabilize everything, what we do is we clip the result of this update between 0 and 1. So we cap the values of the cells to be maximum 1, so that we're sure that if we start to get an exponential runoff, we just cap to 1 and just stay there. So this makes things much more stable when you simulate. So here I have the first question. So I have here a statement which is Lenia is continuous in S, X, and T. So remind you from last time is space state, space, and time. And the question is it true or is it false? I'll give you 1 minute to think about it. Yes, a question?
I think I missed it. So capital K convolved with CT, right?
Yes.
But K is infinite?
K, yeah. So K, if you want, K has compact support. So K is kind of a blob, which is 0 almost everywhere. So when you convolve C with K, it gives you a finite integral. Like the integral is on a finite.
So K is actually 0 at most places.
Exactly, yeah.
But does it decay very slowly, or is it a hard cutoff?
I think for the purpose of simulation, you take a hard cutoff, such that when you need to compute the convolution, you need to do this integral. So if there is a hard cutoff for K, you know that you can hard cut off this integral to a small region. Makes it more easier, much more easy numerically. Another question?
Any reason why you would want very long range interaction anyway?
Sorry?
I guess physically it might not make sense anyway to have very long
Right.
range.
Yeah. So that's a good comment. So what was said is that physically it might not make sense to have a K which is very long tailed, because it's true that this model that we have is non-local, right? The evolution step depends on many points, not at the single point, but we still to kind of keep it reasonably local. So usually you choose a K which is a hard cutoff, so that a point at a position X cannot know what happens here. Because by using the nonlinear function, you could kind of exploit the nonlinearity to maybe infer what's happening very far away. Although it's hard because you still averaging everything. So, but in practice, yeah, the K has limited support. Okay, we have a few votes. Okay, let me try to get up to 10, and then I'll reveal what people think. Yeah, the code is here, by the way, I forgot to mention. Okay. Okay, so the majority here also win. I think some people didn't have time to answer, but that's all right. So I agree with false, the time must remain discrete. I also agree with kind of true, and I will explain why. So the thing is that at this point in our process, I would say that this is a continuous T model, because you can, of course, take this, put it on the other side, divide by dt, take the limit when dt goes to 0. And if you assume some regularity on the function, you can take this limit. And so you can take the dt equals 0 limit. But in this version here, you have a problem, right? Because you have this clipping here, which make it so you cannot really pull out the delta t from this nonlinear function, which is the clipping. So because of the clipping, you cannot formally take this delta t goes to 0 limit. And so it's formally, it's not a continuous T model. But in practice, it almost is, right? When you look at the dynamics, they look super smooth in time. And you can even take the delta t smaller and smaller. And usually you won't have a change in dynamic such that it looks like that it has converged in delta t. But still, there is this paper here which look at things a bit more precisely, and it notices that indeed you have some kind of ill-defined limit. So if you take delta t too small, you will kind of change behaviors when it becomes too small. And I think this is due, I haven't read the paper in details, but of course, if you kind of cook up some dynamics in which the state of the cells remains exactly between 0 and 1, then the clipping kind of disappears, right? The models doesn't feel it, and then it is formally continuous. You can take the limit, etc. Of course, whenever you have some region of the dynamics where you get clipped at 1 or at 0, then these things kick in and it prevents you from taking the formal limit. So this might modify the dynamics. So that's why I say kind of true. Yes?
But what if we always had some component in G, which was like, it's mostly just linear, except at the very end it does like a hard slope to prevent it. Like, when CT gets very close to 1, it just
Right.
gets multiplied. It just gets divided by a large number or something.
Yes. So
Like something that looks like a
right. So the G has to be really negative to make C go down, right? Because G is the change in C. So you would have to have something that kind of has a huge drop off. And maybe you can cook up some G's that in practice, when you launch the dynamics, they kind of constrain you in a continuous manner in between the 0-1 range. Definitely you can cook up some stuff like that.
Not like a short drop off to negative, but I just mean like a sigmoid, but it's really like, compressing.
You mean replace the clipping by a sigmoid, essentially. Yeah. So you can do this, indeed. The problem with that is that I tried to do this at some point, and it was really underwhelming because you had some problems that it's really important, this clipping, especially at 0, because it allows you really to stabilize the vacuum. So if you get all zeros and the value of G at 0 is negative, the zeros will remain zeros, and you kind of need a big pulse to kind of move them out of this thing. With the sigmoid, I don't know, I had problem with the vacuum that always tended to kind of grow slowly, maybe because of the cutoff, which is not sharp, but that's definitely an interesting direction to try and like make. But even if you do the cutoff with the sigmoid here, the sigmoid is still a nonlinear function. So you can still not take the dt out. So in principle, you can take the limit when dt equals 0, then this will linearize the sigmoid. So indeed, maybe there the limit exists. Yeah. Interesting to see. I did some quick tests back in the day, but I was a bit underwhelmed. But maybe I didn't do things properly. Okay. So yeah, and by the way, in the original paper from Lenia, Chan was claiming that this time continuous, you can take the limit, and there was this other paper that came after and that said that not. So it's probably not. Right. Just a last note. Of course, this is a continuous model, but whenever you want to simulate it, you actually need to discretize it. So how do you discretize it? Well, essentially, you do all the steps in reverse from what you did to go from the discrete to the continuous model. So you take your state, it becomes a matrix. You take your kernel, also becomes a matrix, and your function becomes kind of, okay, the function, you might keep it. It will be evaluated at discrete points, but you can just keep it as a function, this one. I'm a bit wrong on this. Of course, the difference is that, yes, we undid all that we did. The difference here is because it is a space and state continuous model, whenever we want to increase the precision, we have a very well-defined prescription of how to make something more precise. Okay, that's why it's different from a discrete model like larger than life. Larger than life, yeah, sure, you can take bigger and bigger kernels and things will look smoother and smoother, but you don't have a prescription of how do you have to change the kernel when you double the precision, for example. Whereas here, since we have the continuous model which is underlying, it's very clear, right? If you make the kernel twice as precise, what value will you put in these pixels, where it's the value of your underlying continuous function at this pixel? Okay, so that's the difference between, in practice, the difference between a discrete and continuous model is that the continuous model, you have a prescription for increasing precision, whereas for the discrete, you don't have that. Okay, so in particular, if you take a very, very low precision, where your kernel is just a 3x3 matrix, so essentially it amounts to say that delta x is equal to 1/3 or 2/3. You can reproduce the game of life because it works with a kernel. All you have to do is take G2 and G of 3 equal to 1. G of everything else is equal to -1. Take delta t equal to 1 and the game of life kernel, and you will see that it reproduces the dynamics. And so you might say, okay, there's a problem here because we said that the game of life is outer holistic, whereas here we're using a holistic function. So how does it work? Well, it's because of this clipping operation we get an additional nonlinearity on top of our G nonlinearity. And this is what allows to emulate this outer holistic dynamics. Okay, any questions so far? Well, there were a few questions, but... Okay, so let's go on to Lenia proper. So Lenia is essentially this equation here. But of course, once again, this has way too much freedom. Okay, the kernel is just a random function. The nonlinearity G, G, by the way, is called the growth. I don't know if I said that. So the growth is also a random function. So what it does in the definition of Lenia is put some constraints on this function such that you reduce the amount of parameters and you can more easily play with the model. So in the original paper, this is the parameters that he chose. So the kernel in full generality should be a function of R2 in R. But we choose to restrict to kernels which have compact support into -1, 1. Okay, so they're necessarily 0 outside of this range. And this is more computationally friendly, as we said, because to compute the convolution, you can restrict your integral. So the first constraint that we choose on the kernel, it's a very natural one, is that it is radially symmetric. So instead of depending on x and y, it just depends on the radius. And this is, of course, comes from the condition that you want your physics or your dynamics to be rotationally invariant, because it's what is physically sensible. So once you do this thing, all you need to choose now is a function from 0, 1 to R, right? Well, technically, if you really want to fill your square, it's a bit more complicated than that, but we'll assume that our kernel is containing a circle inside this square. So how does Bertrand construct this kernel? So he defines a kernel core, KC, which is simply a unimodal function. So unimodal, all it means is just a bump, a single bump. And he forces the bump to be equal to 0 at the endpoints. So these are some examples of the cores that he presents. So you have exponential, polynomial, rectangular. So here they are plotted. So as you can see, between the exponential and the polynomial, there is very little difference. And the rectangular, okay, the rectangular is an approximation, which we won't actually use. We prefer to make everything continuous, of course. And so the reason that he put this constraint, which seems kind of arbitrary, right, that the kernel be exactly 0 at the endpoints, is because what he wants to do is chain the bumps together, okay, to make a multimodal kernel. And the way he does this, okay, it's a bit convoluted the way he does this, but what he wants to do, all he wants to do is take several bumps, okay, B is the amount of bumps, is the rank of the kernel, and just put them, divide the 0, 1 range in an equipartition of B slots, and put one bump in each of these slots with a specific height. Okay, so this is what the formula does for you. So this operator here means the floor function. So you just get what's after the decimal, and you can convince yourself that this kernel, which I call the unnormalized kernel, is doing exactly what I said. So it's taking, if B is equal to 4, it will take 4 copies of the bump spaced equally, and then it will multiply it by these parameters, beta I, which are the scales of the bumps, right? So if you want to think about it, why this works, it's a good exercise. Right, so this we said. So this is an example for B equal 4. For the 4 kinds of kernel cores, you get this kernel function. And I call it unnormalized because the total integral of this KU is not equal to 1. And we want to normalize it such that it is equal to 1 for the good reason that if the integral of K is equal to 1, then if you have a state which has values in between 0 and 1, well, the convolution will as well. Okay, so it's some nice thing. It makes things much simpler. You know that the cell state is between 0 and 1, and the possible sum of neighbors is as well between 0 and 1. So in a way, the sum of neighbors is an average of neighbors, right? So you do this very simply by taking ku and divide it by the value of its integral. Okay, and what I have here in parentheses is if you want to write the discretized version. Okay, so once you have this kernel here, all you need to do is take it and rotate it around to recover the full XY dependence, and you get kernels which look like this. All right. Okay, the kernel is ready. The next thing that we need to specify, okay, so yeah, so by the way, so here we've reduced the dimensionality of our problem immensely, right? Initially, the kernel was just a random function, and now all you need to give me is one parameter here, alpha. Let's say we take the exponential core. Then another parameter here for the rank of the kernel. This is an integer parameter. And then the amount of scaling for each bump. And this is, okay, between, in practice, it's between 2 and 5. Okay. So now you just have to specify it essentially 8 numbers and you have your kernel, which is much easier to navigate than a function. So for the growth, we do something very similar. The growth that Chan chooses is also unimodal. So there is no precise motivation for this. And in fact, yeah, I don't know if people experimented with multimodal growth function. I haven't. But this is, again, from the point of view that we're trying to emulate the game of life, right? So if you look at the growth function of the game of life, it is also unimodal with a peak at, let's say, 3, right? Because around 2 and 3 you survive and all the rest you die. So there is just one region where you can have growth. So that's why I assume you choose unimodal functions. So we choose a function that goes from 0, 1, because the convolution will be in 0, 1, to minus 1, 1. And here, this could be larger, could be r. Yeah, actually, here I would prefer to put r, actually. Because the value of g does not tell you the value that you should reach. It just tells you how much it should alter your state. So if you want to alter it very quickly, you could have a very negative value. That's allowed. And it depends on 2 parameters, mu and sigma, self-explanatory. And the most natural one, although it gives also other polynomial options, etc., is the Gaussian, like so, right? So here I have a Gaussian which I recenter, such that its minimum is at minus 1 and its maximum is at 1. And so it looks like this. And you can only choose its position and its width. And the way to understand the growth function, as I said, is with reference to this red line, which is the line where you have 0 growth. So if you're in this region above the red line, you will tend to increase the amount of stuff. Otherwise, you will tend to decrease. And here, a good baseline for choosing G is that you should impose 100% that G of 0 is smaller than 0, right? So the y-intercept of the function should be smaller than 0. If this is not the case, what does it mean? It means that if you take the vacuum state where everything is dead, the convolution is linear. So the amount of neighbors is also 0. So you're located here. And if you're positive, it means that when you have a vacuum, the vacuum will tend to kind of increase in value. And typically, you don't want that if you want nice behavior, because you won't want solitons that can move in a vacuum, right? Okay, potentially, you can get states where you have solitons that move in a kind of background, but it's simpler to let the vacuum be the vacuum. Okay, so before the break, this is all there is to know about Lenia, the initial version. And I didn't implement it because there was this very nice kind of simulation already on the internet. So how does it work here? So here you have his full classification, which is crazy. So he took Lenia and he kind of scanned a lot of parameters and found a bunch of creatures. And he started to classify them like you would do in biology. Okay, so you have these 4 classes, like the fungi, the plants, and the animals. And then among these classes, you have the orbiforms. Okay, you have the first family, which is Orbidae. Let's look. So you have all these creatures which are not the same, but they look similar. Okay, and you can look at all of them. You have the gyrorbium, vagorbium. Then you have the mesokernels. I'm not sure what it means, but it's bigger creatures. And so you have all these creatures here. You can play with it. It's very nice. You can add more creatures to see what happens when they collide. Typically, when they collide, they're very unstable, usually, unfortunately. So when they collide, you usually get, here they're pretty stable, these ones. Okay, yeah. Okay, and the one thing I want to show you again here is that you can increase the resolution here. So 52 cells per kernel radius. So how much the kernel is well defined. And so here you see, if I increase, first of all, the creature is very resilient, right? Because we are not scaling the creature, we're just scaling the precision and then let the creature evolve. So we see that it resists these changes. And as we do this, the creature gets bigger, again, because increase the precision in this point of view is zooming in. But you will try with most of the creatures, they're all very resilient. So it means that we're kind of converged, right? The precision is enough such that you have a good picture of what's happening in the continuous limit. And the one thing to note here is that all these creatures, each time I click on a creature, you can see the parameters change here, right? So if you go into calculations, you can see all the parameters. So here we have the growth function. Here we have the kernel. And all these creatures, as usual, they live in the multiverse. So none of those live in the same universe, right? So they cannot meet, and it's one of the big problems of Lenia. You cannot make this creature meet and interact. So you have great differences, but not in the same universe, in the multiverse. And here you can also play with the delta t. So here, presumably, if you take a delta t which is smaller and smaller, you might have some creatures which stop working. You have to be very patient for this, of course, because if you increase the definition of delta t, things move much slower. But potentially here you could see the fact that it's not really time continuous. But most of the creatures that I've seen, they're pretty resilient. So here I'm reducing the time step. And at some point, things break down. Increasing the time step, sorry. Anything else to say about this? Not really, I don't think. Yeah, play around with it. It's very nice. And let's make the break and meet at 15. Okay, let's start again. So this was the original Lenia. So it has a single channel, as we say. So by channel, I mean each pixel of the screen is determined by a single value, right? So it's either 0 or 1. The cells here get 1, 0, 1. So the first extension that was also done by Bert Chan was to add more channels in an attempt to increase the complexity and potentially the diversity of things that can happen. So this is the same idea that I very briefly mentioned for the MNCAs, where you had like kind of these different color kernels. But let's see it a bit in more detail here. So now that you have several channels, the full state of the world is not defined by a single function, but a bunch of functions. So the most classic one for Lenia, at least, is to have 3 channels which represent the amount of red, green, and blue. But another way to think about these channels is that they represent different chemicals or different particles. Okay, so each of these channels will have different rules for how it evolves, right? So now the new equation, it's very simple to extend, becomes this thing here. So as you can see, it's very similar to what we had before, with a few additions. So here we have a sum over J, where J is the channel. J in J in channels. And we have this sum here. So what do we have here? So first, the kernel now, instead of having a single kernel, we'll have 9 kernels. Okay, so it's easier to see as a 3 by 3 set of kernels. And the kernels KGI, the kernel KGI will compute the contribution coming from channel J towards channel I. Okay, so the same thing for the growth function. You have a 3x3 set of growing function, and so the growing function g of ji will tell you how much the channel j will contribute to the growth of channel number I. So another way to see it is that, or similar way to see it is that each channel gets 3 contribution from each of the other channels, okay? And the way this contribution is computed is exactly the same as in the initial Lenia, okay? So you just do the convolution with the specific channel, apply the growth function, and that's a contribution. And so what you do with these 3 contributions for all the channels, you just do a weighted average of these contributions with specific weighting factors, BJI. And so these are simply reals that sum to 1, and they tell you how much this channel should influence this one. So for example, you could have the red channel, you compute convolutions with the red, green, and blue channels. This gives you 3 numbers. You apply the respective growth functions. This gives you 3 new numbers. And then you say, okay, this red channel should not be affected by what happens in the red channel. So the B value coming from the red channel will be 0, and the other will be 1/2. And the result of that is that the values in the red channel will not affect what happens to the red channel. It will only depend on what happens in the blue and green channel. So using these kernels, it allows you to both have self-interaction, just like before. Your past value influences your future value, but you also have self-interactions between channels. That's other channels can influence what happens to you. And this promotes some kind of cooperation between the different colors. So this is the kind of representation that you see for the kernels. So let me explain. So we have 3 images here, and each image corresponds to the kernel that the respective channel will use. So this will be the kernel used by the red channel, this will be the kernel used by the green channel, and this one from the blue channel. And so why are the kernel colorful? It just means that the blue part of the kernel is the kernel that will be convolved with the blue channel. Okay, so let's take the example here for the kernel that goes towards the blue channel. It has 3 colors. So you see the red is present here and here. So it means that when the blue goes on to compute the contribution from the red channel, it will use this kernel here, right? Just the red parts. Then when it wants to go and see the contribution from the green channel, it will use just the green parts, and the same for the blue, right? So here, when you see rainbow colors, it just means that different kernels are overlapping, creating other colors. So this is a compact representation of your 9x9 kernel matrix. And it's kind of intuitive. So if you see a lot of one color, it means that this channel will be mostly affected by this color, at least in the computation of the sum of neighbors, right? So as you can see here, we have a lot of green. So this channel, which is the third one, so the blue channel, will be most affected by green. Now, actually, it depends also of what you choose for the growth and the weighting factors, but it gives you an idea. Right, and so for this model, so these models that we have implemented for some works with 2 students, we used the Lenia specification, but slightly changed. So for the kernel core, we use a Gaussian bump instead of this like kind of smooth exponential. So we don't really care if it goes to 0 or not. And for each of the colored kernel, we choose 3 rings, and the rings have random scales, okay? So here, for example, there is also a 3rd red ring, but it's very faint, so you don't see it. And the position of the rings, they are not spaced equally, as in chance formulation. The position of the rings can be anything you like, right? They don't have to be spaced equally. So let's look at the kind of behaviors that you get with this formulation. Whoops. So this is on the repo, so you can also play with it. It's called multi-Lenia here. And so let me run this if it wants. Right, so this is the initial condition, which is some random noise with some scale. So if I run this, this is the typical things you get from random parameters. Okay, so here I'm gonna change the parameters and restart. Here are new parameters which I sampled randomly. So you very often, okay, this is quite a nice one. Okay, this is also very reminiscing of the Turing patterns, right? And very often the Lenia looks like some Turing model, so they're very related. So these are random patterns. You get some nice thing, but most things are like this, right? They grow and they occupy everything. It's quite rare to get some solitons. Even though here the prior that I chose, it's kind of made to increase the amounts of solitons, but okay, most of the time just everything dies randomly. So here I also have a bunch of saved parameters which are a bit more interesting that I can show you here. Let's see, we have this thing here, which is kind of nice because it does not occupy all the space, but it does not completely die, at least not very quickly. And this is the kind of cool parameters you can get. So here you have some gliders, and here I can try, yeah, here I can show you the kernels. So down to the left are the kernels that are used to make this thing. And I can zoom them in to get more precision. And okay, we see these gliders appearing here, which are quite robust. Right, so a few more parameters. Here we have one where we have replication, right? So these kind of small gliders, they immediately replicate into two, but when they collide, they die. So it gives a nice self-sustaining thing, right? Here we have also a very common thing. It's kind of slow growing of cell-like things. Again, this is very similar to the Turing patterns. You get these sort of spirals that slowly grow. Okay, a bunch of behaviors. But the key here is that all of these things, they were not kind of sampled randomly. So if you sample things randomly, it's pretty rare to find nice stuff. And so here I'm doing a bit of a publicity. So the parameters that I've showed you here, the way that they were obtained was that we were trying to look in parameter space for regions that were on a phase transition. Okay, what do I mean by that? So you saw that when I take random parameters, most of the time, either everything dies out or everything occupies, something grows and occupies all the screen. So if you call this the dying phase and the exploding phase, you can try to put 2 points in parameter space. And since the parameter space is continuous, you can kind of walk from one point to another continuously. So you know that at the beginning you're exploding and at the end you're dying. Well, on your path, there must be a point where you're kind of in the middle. And so that's what we did to find the parameters that I showed you. These are parameters that lie somehow between the dying and exploding phase. And so there is a very short paper, if you want to read it, by us, by me, Arthur, and Guilhem, and also Clément. So if you want to read it, it's 4 pages, super simple, very short, and it explains what we did. It's really nothing very complicated. So this is a plot of the phase space in the original Lenia with just one channel. So this comes from Bertrand's paper. And as you can see, here it's still quite zoomed in, right? So the mu goes from 15 to 5. The sigma goes from 002 to 012. And the region in which you get actual creatures, it's relatively small, right? So if you pick randomly in this region, you will very rarely get some stuff. And even worse, these creatures, as we have seen from the simulations before, they are not really emerging from random initial conditions, right? So they exist and they are stable, but if you start from a random soup, they are very unlikely to arrive. So if you restrict this to the region of parameter space where things emerge automatically, it's even thinner. But of course, here I presume, I haven't tried it, but I'm pretty sure it's true. If you go upwards of this kind of line, you will get dying things, and below this line you will get exploding things. Why do I say that? Because as we can see, the region below increases when we increase the sigma. And this is because if the growth function becomes more and more wide, you get a bigger and bigger region which generates positive growth. And so you're more likely to get exploding stuff. And here, conversely, if you increase mu, you get further and further away from the zero region, which is the exploding region for the growth function. So probably all of these species indeed lie at a sort of phase transition point. Okay, this was just some ad for our paper. But the way that Bird-Chan and also Slackermans that I mentioned the other time found their interesting parameter sets is using something they call interactive evolutionary computation. So they don't say exactly what they do, but essentially this method is very simple. So what you do is you choose random parameters, you see a bunch of videos, and you rank the videos from most interesting to least interesting, or even you just pick the 5 best videos. Then you take these videos, you take the parameters of these videos, you mutate them or cross them, generate a bunch of videos, and begin again. So it is essentially a genetic algorithm. You select the best performers, but the fitness function is what is good, looks cool to you. Okay, so using this method, you can get some nice stuff. I don't know if this will run while I'm streaming. Oh, it does. Okay, these are some of the things that were found in the multi-channel Lenia from Bird-Chan. Yeah. So you see, what's really cool about this compared to what I've showed you is that the solitons are extremely stable. Okay, they can bump each other, etc. They will not die, and they seem to have different state. Okay, here they were linked. Sometimes they stop, and so on. Here we have other things. Okay, this one is really nice because it's kind of unstable, but it was generating these small gliders. Okay, here again. Okay, they seem to move faster because it's making a lot of time steps per frame. Right? It's not that it's inheriting faster. This one is really nice, right? So you have these aggregates, which are very robust, and the cells can also detach and go somewhere else. So this really looks like something you would see under the microscope. At least to me, I haven't seen many microscopes, but right. And so these were found with this method of interactive evolutionary computation. And so here, what I wanted to mention, just because I haven't seen it done in artificial life, is that recently there was this method that was developed, which is called reinforcement learning with human feedback, to fine-tune the models like ChatGPT. Okay, and in spirit, it's very similar to this IEC that they mentioned. But the key advantage of RLHF is that the goal is to remove the human from the loop. Because the problem with IEC is that, okay, now that I've shown you the things, you may say, oh, it looks super cool. I would really like to kind of rank these things for hours. I also thought so as well, but as soon as you've done 30 minutes of this, everything looks the same and it's super boring. So you cannot keep up long with this IEC. So the idea of RLHF is the following. It's very simple. So you first start just as I mentioned before. So you generate some dynamics, rank the most interesting dynamics, and collect a bunch of data. So the order of magnitude that they claim for this, depending on the application, is between 500 to 1,000 human rankings. Once you have this stuff, you use it to train a neural network, which is called the reward model. And this neural network, its goal is to learn your fitness function. Like it's to learn what looks interesting to you using this ranking data. And then once you have this reward model, you can just use it to do the ranking in your place, right? So you use it again in the same way as EIC, but except you don't do the ranking, it's the reward model that does it. And it allows you to generate much, much more data this way. And it seems to work pretty well, at least in the context of ChatGPT and some other tasks. And as far as I know, we'll see maybe in the live conference this year, but I haven't seen anybody try this for artificial life systems. So I think it would be a very interesting direction. And if somebody is well versed in this kind of machine learning stuff with reinforcement learning and human feedback, it would be very interesting to collaborate on this. But okay, let's go back to Lenia. So, right, the spin-off model. So this, the one that I showed you and the multi-channel part, this was base Lenia, is introduced by Berchan. And now I want to take a quick look at some spin-offs model, which essentially took Lenia as inspiration and modified some small thing to try and solve some of the problems that Lenia has. So the first one is asymptotic Lenia, but it's kind of the less interesting one. So I think I'm going to skip it for now and come back if we have time. Just in a few words, what asymptotic Lenia is trying to do is solve this problem that Lenia is not time continuous. Okay, so they rephrase the evolution equation. It's very simple in spirit, and they get something which is similar to Lenia, but is formally time continuous. And that's pretty much it. People haven't used it much other than that. Here you have a video with some of the dynamics, which essentially looks identical to Lenia. But in practice, it's much more annoying to use precisely because it is much more unstable, right? You don't have this clipping, essentially. That's pretty much what it does. And without this clipping, you have to be much more careful about what you do. And this is the kind of stuff you have. They say that it looks smoother. To me, honestly, it looks the same. Okay, and the last thing, which is kind of interesting, there's just a beautiful visualization. It's this one, where they mixed, one of the channels uses asymptotic Lenia and the other ones use traditional Lenia. And somehow they claim that it allows you to have this kind of glider gun that appears. I'm really uncertain about the reason they managed to do this because of asymptotic Lenia. I really don't know why it would be the case, but yeah. So we'll go back to this if we have time. Otherwise, you can take a look. It's quite simple. Okay, the one I wanted to show, which is a bit more different, is particle Lenia. So particle Lenia is essentially a reformulation of Lenia, but instead of having kind of this continuous field for your matter, you have particles, discrete particles that interact each other. Okay, it was invented by Mordvintsev, Niklasson, and Randazzo, which are all of three are at Google Zurich doing research on artificial life. And the main features or the main things that it does, quote unquote, better than Lenia is that it bakes in mass conservation. Okay. Since you have a particle system, there is no way for these particles to disappear. And so you, from the get-go, you remove these problems where you have some, how do you say, some configuration that explodes. As we have seen in all the solitons that Berchan found, they're all very prone to explosion when they interact. Well, here you have a finite amount of particles, so you cannot explode as much as you want because you would have to kind of spread thin all your particles. And yeah, so this problem with Lenia, that things can either disappear or explode, makes it very hard to find solitons because the solitons are essentially a very fine equilibrium between these two states. So in models like particle Lenia, it's much simpler to find solitons. So how does it work? You'll see it's very similar. So you have a fixed number of particles, we'll say n, and you put them randomly scattered in the initial condition. And now the particle, they will generate a potential, okay? So if you're not from physics, they will generate some kind of force field that will affect the other particles. And how do they generate this force field? Well, the force field is somehow the analog of the growth function, okay? Is what dictates how the state will change in the next time step. And so again, we use two steps. We first compute, we first do actually a convolution with the particles. So in this case, you have a kernel, which is again a radially symmetric function, and you compute this u of x, which is the precursor of this potential, as very simply the potential at position x is just the sum over all the particles, and you evaluate the kernel with the distance from the particle to the thing. Okay, so this is secretly a convolution because the sum over kx minus xi, which is this thing here, you can write it as a convolution with C, where C is a distribution that contains only Dirac deltas. Okay, so I don't know how people who are not from physics or math are familiar with this notation, but this is essentially a way to write a function which is zero everywhere and infinitely big at the location xi. Okay, so it's just as in Lenia, we have a concentration of particles, but instead of this concentration being smooth, it is completely localized at the position of the particles. And still we are doing the convolution. Okay, so the first step to get the convolution, so the sum of neighbor in some sense. And the convolution kernel is again just some Gaussian rings, right? Then you use a growth function, same exact as before, which is a Gaussian again. And you apply it to the result of the convolution. And this is what gives you, again, the nonlinearity. So once you have this value here, this gives you a field over your region, the G of U field. And you interpret this as a potential. Okay. In reality, it's a negative potential, but that's fine. So the equation of motions, so what we need to derive now is no longer how the concentration changes, but how the particle move. So you have an equation of motion for each particle, and it's very simple. Each particle which will try to go in a location of maximum growth. Okay, so we have this growth field here, and the speed of the particle will be in the direction of maximum growth. So if you view this growth function as some hillside, the particles will try to go on the maxima. Okay, very good. So this is analogous again to Lenia, where you had high growth, you will get high concentration. Well, here in practice, you get the same thing. Where you have high growth, all the particles will tend to go there. But now you have a problem, because of course, when you have a local maximum of growth, all the particles will tend to want to kind of group together in this local maximum. And so you might have problems where you have overlapping particles. So to prevent that, what you do is put a small force field around each of the particles. So it's essentially small springs around the particles, which repel other particles with a spring force. Okay. So in practice, how you do this is you add this force term. Okay. And so you see this minimum is essentially used so that this force term has no effect if the particles are far enough. And then when the particle get close enough, it becomes a spring force, right? So we modify the equation, and now the speed of a particle tries to go in the direction of steepest ascent of growth, plus, here I need a sum, J different from I, right? Plus the forces of repulsion between all other particles, right? So if you're a physicist, you can see that this force of repulsion, you can also rewrite it as a potential force, and then you can put the two potentials together, R minus G, to get the full potential. And if you look at this potential, it will tell you in which direction the particle will go. So this is the kind of thing that you obtain, right? So what you see on the left in yellow, the yellow region are the high growth regions, right? So as you can see, the particles tend to go towards the yellow regions. And on the right, you see the full energy. So it's essentially growth minus the repulsion. and you see that there are some particles that find themselves in red positions, although they don't want to stay there. And what's cool is that you get these behaviors which do not settle, right? And so here I have the last question for today, is that since the evolution equations, as we've seen, what the particles are trying to do, they're trying to go to the lowest energy position, right? That's the definition of this equation of motion. So the question is, why do we get this kind of oscillating behavior instead of just going to the minimum of energy and then settling there and staying there? So this is the question. Why do we not get settled dynamics? Okay. I'll give you a minute. Show you another video in the meantime. Okay. All right, let's take a look at the answers. So so most people got it right. So the cutoff and the repulsion might be an answer, but the way that the cutoff is made, okay, I showed it very fast so you can know, but the cutoff is made such that the function is still continuous, so it does not make any problems in terms of the energy landscape. But the main thing is that, yes, so in this equation, as you can see, here we evaluate at x equal xi. So what it means is that each particle is looking at its own energy and trying to do what's best to maintain its own energy. Of course, what's best for one particle might be very bad for the others, or even many of the others. And so that's what generates instability. Each particle is greedily trying to minimize its energy, and this may cause obstruction to reaching the global minimum, because maybe in the global minimum, some particles are not happy about where they are, right? And so here they have a very nice video in the paper, actually. But they changed the equation of motion such that each particle moves so as to minimize the global energy of all the particles. And in that case, you can see that very quickly, you reach here a stable minimum where all the particles are happy. So here, this will global descent. And then they switch on the local dynamics, and then the particles moves and start to oscillate. Okay. So that's a very nice thing, that the fact that the particles are selfish generates from you dynamic behavior. Right. And so one main, let's say, one big advantage that they have at this Google team is that they're super good into making things look good. So as you can see, this is much more like entertaining and enticing than these simulations here. And it's exactly the same model. They just put some very nice shaders on top of things to make them look extremely like lifelike. And so, you get, this is an example of actually a steerable creature where if you move the particles slightly, they will stay where they are and change the movement of the particles. So that's really cool. And the main takeaway is that you have a huge diversity of these solitons, okay? And this is precisely because you cannot explode or you cannot die. And since the particles, they want to be in a high growth region, and growth is generated when there are a lot of particles, the particles also don't want to get broken apart. So necessarily the particle will be bunched together, and if you get some sort of instability because of the greediness, you get some movement, and so you get those very nice things. Yeah. So let me see if they have also a simulation in 3D. Not here, but yeah, I'll let you look at the end of the video at home. Okay, so this was particle Lenia. Any questions about this model here? All right. So the last one I wanted to present is flow Lenia, which actually, I believe it is a predecessor, or they arrived almost at the same time, of particle Lenia. And flow Lenia, trying to solve essentially the same problem as particle Lenia did. It tries to impose mass conservation on the dynamics of Lenia for the same reasons. Right, so flow Lenia, it can be seen as essentially particle Lenia in the limit where there is an infinite density of particle. Okay, so it's the same connection as LGCA with lattice Boltzmann models. We go from a lot of particles to a density of particles. So the equations, we go back to a density. So it's a smooth field C that denotes how much mass of something there is. The growth is computed exactly the same way as Lenia. But instead of considering it as a growth, so as increasing the density, it will be interpreted as an affinity. That's what they call it, and they write it U. All right, so it's me from the future, and I just want to correct something on the lecture in the recording. So during the course, I claimed that the equation of flow Lenia were the following, right? So you wanted to follow increasing affinity. And so I wrote the partial derivative of the concentration over time is equal to the gradient of the affinity. But this equation obviously makes no sense because on the left we have a scalar quantity, whereas on the right we have a vector-like quantity, right, the gradient. So this is completely wrong, although the spirit is correct. And okay, I didn't think about it because I was thinking in my head about 1D things where this equation is actually admissible, although it's still wrong. So let's remove this and let's see what is the corrected equation. So what we want to do is still the same thing, is push our matter, or density of matter, to flow towards the higher affinity regions. This is true. So if we want to introduce a flow of matter, contrary to the particle Lenia case where, okay, we have our particles, we just give the particles a speed. Here we also need to introduce the speed of the matter. And this information is not contained inside the density of the matter. So we need to introduce a new field, which is the flow velocity, and it is a vector field which we call U, right? And this field tells you how the matter flows. So what we'll be influencing is this matter velocity field. So in the paper, the problem is precisely also why I had the wrong equation, is that they do not give the continuous equations for the flow. They directly give the discretized version with a discretization scheme, which I mentioned later, which is a bit opaque. And so to find the actual continuous equation, I had to do a bit of reverse engineering. And now I think I have the correct answer, although I'm not 100% sure. So the answer that I think is correct is that what they do is that they set the velocity of the fluid, so this flow velocity vector, directly to be equal to the gradient of the affinity. So they set the velocity of the particles to directly be the velocity that maximizes their affinity. Okay, so this means that U is equal to, maybe let me write it in reverse, it makes a bit more sense. Okay. Right. So their velocity flow is exactly equal to the gradient of the affinity, so they will tend to move towards higher affinity regions. And this will also name F for flow, but all right. So why do we do it like that? Okay, this doesn't seem very physical. Usually you have acceleration with it, which is equal to the force. And the reason is the same reason that I think I gave before for particle Lenia, where we are in a regime where the viscosity forces are dominant. So there is no inertia, so to speak. In other words, the particle do not follow the force is equal to the acceleration, but they follow the force is equal to their velocity. And if you want to see where this equation comes from, it's very easy. You take the limit gamma to infinity of these equations. This equation here. So what is this equation? We have ma, which is the force. Here minus gamma v, it is a viscosity force because it is inversely proportional with gamma, the proportionality constant, to the velocity of the particle, right? So it tends to lower the velocity of the particle. And here, when we apply the force, I also put a gamma in front because if you want to move your particle in any meaningful way in a viscous fluid, well, your force should be at least as strong as the viscosity force. And so if now we let the limit gamma goes to infinity, you see that the acceleration is negligible, and then you get this equation F equal V. So we are also in this regime of viscosity forces dominates. And that's why the equation that we apply is directly U equal gradient of the affinity as opposed to du dt equal gradient of the affinity, for example. So, okay, that's all good and well, but this still does not tell us how the concentration C evolves, right? And so the way the concentration, we get the concentration equation, it's simply the other condition that we want flow linear to conserve mass. So we impose mass conservation, which is the following equation. This is the famous continuity equation in fluids. So the partial derivative of the density plus the divergence of the matter flow. Okay, this is the matter flow because we multiply the velocity by the density is equal to 0. And so this imposes mass conservation. Why? Well, simply if you write the mass as the double integral of the density, and you take the derivative of the mass to show that it doesn't change, you put the partial derivative inside the integral, you apply the continuity equation, you get this, and then from the divergence theorem, you can change this into an integral over the surface. And so if you have a world which has no boundaries, for example, an infinitely big world or a compact world like a torus, you'll get that you have no boundary, so this is 0. Or if you want to introduce a boundary, you can set boundary conditions such that this integral is 0. So in other words, there is no net inflow of mass inside or outside. Okay, so we have mass conservation and we have our equation, and so all we need to do is take this u and replace it by the affinity gradient. And if we do that, we get the following equation here for the partial derivative of our concentration. And so the flow linear equations are actually this equation here, where u is the gradient, the affinity that we computed with the Lenia rule. Okay, so we have two terms here. So here I write in terms of the flow. The first one, I believe it's an advection term. So this is principal cause of the transport. And the second one, you can see you have a Laplacian that appears here, is a diffusion-like coefficient. So this causes some kind of diffusion in your fluid. And that's what allows you to conserve mass, of course. And I think that's all I wanted to say. So let's go back to present day Vasilis to continue. Okay. So in practice, as usual, you have to make some regularization to avoid things becoming infinitely concentrated. So what you do is pretty much the same thing that it was in particle Lenia. You had a small repulsive force that activates when things get pretty dense. And so the way they do it in the paper is that they take that the flow will be a weighted average between the actual affinity flow and another flow here. This is a diffusive flow, which pushes the concentration such that you lower the total concentration. Okay, so here C sigma is just the total concentration over all channels, because you can have multiple channels. And alpha Okay, I don't go into the details, but alpha is a parameter which can go between 0 and 1, and it will be very close to 1 when the concentration is much bigger than theta. So you choose theta, it's a threshold that you don't want to go over with your concentration. Let's say 2 or 3, let's say. And this alpha will kick in and include this term that smoothes out your concentration whenever you get to dangerous levels. Okay, the details are not very important. This is not what is creating the nice stuff, but it's necessary to avoid the bad stuff. So if you have to remember something, just remember that we increase the diffusion or the concentration lowering flow when the concentration goes higher than some threshold. So this is something that's summarized that I just told you. So in Lenia, what you do, you take your state, convolve, apply the growth, you get the growth function, and you just sum it with the state to get the next state. In flow Lenia, what you do is, the first step is the same, compute the growth, which is now called the affinity. Then you take the gradient of this to determine the direction of flow. This denotes the normalization of the flow. This gives you a flow direction. You flow your stuff towards this direction and you get the new state. Okay. And here on the right, you have a comparison of random parameters. Because the parameters of flow Lenia, this is another advantage. I don't know how important it is, but the parameters of flow Lenia are exactly the same as the parameters of Lenia because all the parameters are contained in K and G, and so it's the same. So here are some random initial conditions. So you see that in Lenia, either everything is dead or everything is occupied. But in flow Lenia, of course, since you have conservation of mass, you always get some small things surviving. Right, and then there are some details about the implementation, which, to be honest, I don't fully understand. So me, very naively, I haven't done any numerical physics or numerical analysis. You give me this equation. What I will do is just put everything on a grid, write the derivative as I plus 1 minus I over delta x, and go on my way. I think this will give not so nice result. So the way that they do this they apply this flow equation is that they use something called reintegration tracking. Okay, when I first read that, I thought it was a well-established numerical scheme from some numerical analysis paper or something. But actually, it's literally just one blog post of a guy that creates shaders for fluids. And they look very good. I mean, this is the reintegration tracking on action. But I have really hard time to see if it's really implementing the flow equation or if it's doing something which is similar and looks very good, but it's not actually the real thing. So here there is a project idea. If this interests you, I would be very interested to kind of study a bit more precisely what is this reintegration tracking and what equation it discretizes. Because when you look at it, essentially what it does is that it separates the world into cells. And then for each cell, it looks at the direction of flow. It takes what's in the cell, moves it along the direction, and then redistributes the matter according to which cells it intersects. Okay. So at face value, it seems that it's flowing each cell in the correct direction. But the redistribution part is very strange because you can choose how wide you do the redistribution. And they claim that this introduces some kind of diffusion. When you choose how wide you redistribute, it adds some diffusion term to the dynamics. So maybe this reintegration tracking, what it is doing implicitly is to add some diffusion term to this flow equation. I'm not sure. So here you can look. So when you do this redistribution, you can choose how widely to redistribute. And they call this the temperature parameter. The higher the temperature, the more widely you will redistribute. And in some sense, the more you will diffuse. And so here they have a video of the flow Lenia dynamics, where on the left, you have very low temperature. On the right, you have very high temperature. So clearly, this reintegration tracking is doing more than just solving the flow equation. It's introducing something else. And we see that the sweet spot, it's not at 0 temperature, where it's kind of flowing exactly, but at some in between. So I think, yeah, this was a bit surprised, because it seems that the reintegration tracking is essential to get good flow linear dynamics, but it isn't part of the actual equations. It's just part of the discretization scheme, but evidently it's not only a discretization scheme. So yeah, that's a thing that could warrant some studying if somebody is interested and knows a bit more about numerical analysis. Hi, so it's me from the future again, just to add a small comment on this reintegration tracking story. So now that I have the updated equations, I can more or less more confidently say that what the reintegration tracking is implementing is actually this equation here. So this conservation of mass continuity equation, right? So given a flow U, which we compute, as we said, like so, the reintegration tracking is discretizing or implementing on a discrete grid this equation here. Okay, so the natural diffusion term that I mentioned erroneously, that is kind of introduced out of nowhere, I believe now to be essentially a realization of this thing. However, this does not answer the question of what is this temperature. So what is this temperature parameter that you have in this reintegration tracking scheme, discretization scheme? So maybe there is some conditions of stability where you have to take it in some middle value, such that you implement actually the diffusion in the discretized model, or maybe not. Maybe it's indeed an extra parameter that goes in front of this thing. This is really unclear to me for now, but I just wanted to make a comment on what the reintegration tracking is actually discretizing. So it's really a way to discretize this flow equation, although I'm not sure exactly how it's doing that. Okay, so back to the present. And okay, here they have a video of random initial conditions in Lenia. As usual, we see the explosion or death. Some have some solitons. And this is the equivalent in flow Lenia. So obviously nothing explodes or dies. And you can intuitively guess that it will be much easier to find some solitons here. So some of the cool dynamics that they have on the paper are these snakes here. So this would be typically very hard to get in Lenia. It does happen, but yeah, I put the same video accidentally. It was 2 video initially, but that's fine. And here you have some other stuff. Again, this is kind of reminiscing of this particle Lenia, but in a continuous version where it's kind of unstable. Everybody's greedily wanting to go somewhere. Here you have division. This is also very common in Lenia, but in Lenia, when you have this, you have division, and either you flood the whole space, or you divide so much that you die off. Whereas here, it's really nice, because you cannot divide more than a bunch of stuff, because mass is conserved, so you get these remnants here that can then interact, combine, then decombine. So I think it's really, really much nicer than Lenia, at least from what I've seen so far. I haven't had time to implement it, especially because of this reintegration tracking, which was kind of fishy. But yeah. So one last thing that I want to mention, and so give me 5 minutes. If you need to go, just go. So beside the mass conservation, the advantage of flow Lenia is that it makes it possible to join these multiverses together so that they interact. Okay, and it's kind of hacky, but it works. So what you do is that you take the parameters of the kernel or whatever, and you promote it to also be a field on your space, right? And so now what you do is that you let the parameters flow with the matter. So when you compute the flow with the flow Lenia equations, you let the parameters also flow along this. And of course, here you have many problems. So what does it mean that you have less of a parameter in a region and more of a parameter somewhere? It doesn't mean anything. And so what they do is actually, this is one another thing which means that flow Lenia is not at all the equation that they claim it is that this parameters flow is directly integrated with this reintegration tracking mechanism. So in the reintegration tracking, you really take a cell of parameter and you flow it. And since you have these precisely defined cells, you can say, I look at all the parameters that are flowing into this cell, and I update the parameter of this cell to be the average of what's incoming. And so the parameters does not lose in mass. It's not like translated. It just flows with the matter and is averaged over, such that if you have two creatures that have different parameters that collide, you will get kind of a creature which is the average of the parameters. But this is really using this discrete model. So it's no longer a continuous model. It's really a discrete model because you have to use finite cells and with reintegration tracking. So, okay. But it allows you to kind of merge the multiverse and let things interact together. And this is what you have here. So the different colors are color-coded parameters. So you have these different creatures that in Lenia would be completely separated. And here they can now interact. And why is this really nice? It's because it gives you the rare opportunity to have this huge simulation with a lot of different parameters and let things evolve and see what happens naturally, okay? With pure natural selection, some parameters will infect others, some will not manage to, some will collaborate. So you can see here that you have some creatures where you have a core with a certain set of parameters surrounded by a membrane of other set. So here you can get very nice stuff. So I'm assuming they're preparing a paper for this year's Alive. We haven't heard much about this since then, but I think this is very, very promising. And so the very last thing that I wanted to do is another thing which is very nice about Flowlenia is that these solitons are much more robust than in Lenia. And so, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. So here the last thing I wanted to do is, again, about intrinsic evolution. Since you have mass conservation, you can use this to your advantage because mass is now a scarce resource. Okay. So what you can do is take your model, make everything decay with a constant rate. So a creature will slowly die if it doesn't do anything. And you can put these food bits and arrange them such that when you go over a food bit, it will replenish your mass. And so if you put a bunch of food bits and prepare an initial condition, what should happen from pure survival of the fittest is that the creatures that are able to kind of move and eat and maybe reproduce will be the most successful, and so they will evolve. Okay, we're still far from open-ended evolution, but it's a very promising direction, I think. And the last thing, which is training the model, I will let it for next time because it's a perfect segue into next week's subject, which is neural cellular automata. So yeah, that's it. See you next week.